Good evening, everybody, and thank you for tuning in on Zoom or attending in person. My name is Susie Arnold, and I work at the Island Institute as their marine scientist, and I'm excited to be talking to you today about science action and hope as it pertains to ocean climate change. So a little bit of background about the Island Institute. We were founded back in 1983. We are a community development organization based in Rockland, Maine. And our mission is to serve the coastal and island communities along the coast. We've got about a staff of about 50 full-time staff, and we partner with supporters and coastal community citizens to essentially do what you see here. These are our three pillars. We empower strong leaders, we develop climate solutions, and we strive to promote resilient economies along the Maine coast. So, as I mentioned, today I'll be speaking about ocean climate change, science, action, and hope. And as the marine scientist at the organization, and as a member of the Maine Climate Council, and a co-chair of the scientific and technical subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council, I'm often asked to give presentations on the state of ocean climate change in Maine. And as you might imagine, with the marine heat waves and the rising seas, and the warming water and the increasing invasive species outbreaks that we're seeing. This typically can, while it's accurate and important, this message can be a little bit daunting, overwhelming. And so today I'm going to focus a bit more on something that I think is lacking in this area, which is action. So what we can do about some of these climate stressors and the critical importance of hope. So I wanted to start with something that I'm also asked about pretty frequently is, so in this position, what makes me hopeful? And I think that that's really important to reflect on. And so first and foremost, I think my colleagues at the Island Institute make me feel hopeful. Like I said, I work with about 50 very committed people who devote their lives to improving life for people on the Maine coast. And then I challenge myself to identify 3 people that I've worked with in the last month on issues relating to the impacts of ocean climate change that have inspired me. And so I'm going to mention one person in each of these kind of fields that I work on. So I'll be talking about ocean warming, I'll be talking about ocean acidification, and I'll be talking about rising seas. And so the first person I'd like to share that has inspired me in the last month is Ben Conniff. He's the co-founder of Luke's Lobsters. Luke's Lobsters is one of the biggest seafood processing companies here in Maine. You might be familiar with the Luke's Lobster Shack down in the Portland waterfront. They also have shacks across the US and across the globe, actually. And so they are a really forward-thinking company, and they are looking into the entire carbon footprint of their business from cradle to grave, as they call it. So from the moment that a fisherman who they buy their lobsters from leaves the dock, catches that lobster's processed, and all the way up until it's either shipped to a shack and you get it in the form of a lobster roll, or it's shipped to your house where you eat it, you boil it yourself and eat it. So the consumer will be able to understand the kilograms of carbon that it took for them to enjoy that Maine lobster. And so it's not just an effort to improve the sustainability of their business, but it's also going to be shared industry-wide with the whole seafood sector in Maine, so that folks who are interested in reducing their climate footprint or their carbon footprint can know where the most emissions are being produced in the process of producing that seafood. So is it from bait? Is it from transportation? Is it from fuel? So all of those things are being looked at. So I'm very inspired by the work of Ben, who is leading that work from Luke's Lobsters. So someone who's working hard on action against ocean acidification is my colleague, Nicole Price at Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences. She's a senior scientist there. She's also the director of their Center for Seafood Solutions. And she's doing just that. She's directing her science to come up with solutions related to Maine seafood. And so one thing that she's done that I've been involved in the last few weeks is she's communicating with folks in DC to bring research funding to things that can improve our climate. So for instance, she has shared the importance of how marine vegetation can play a role in taking up carbon dioxide and improving locally ocean acidification with governments of the US government. And so the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, now has an aquaculture division, and Congress has appointed funds to that aquaculture division of USDA to research pilot projects on farmed seaweeds and also seagrasses that can also remediate ocean acidification and contribute to carbon sequestration. So that's super exciting. She's going to be writing up a report for Congress that will include the findings of these pilot projects that will be funded in the next few weeks. So lastly, who inspires me around sea level rise action is someone named Carol White, who lives on Chebeague Island in Casco Bay. And Carol is a longtime partner of the Island Institute. She runs her own consulting business. She's a groundwater expert. She also teaches at Southern Maine Community College. And she's also extremely active in all things community in her community of Chebeague. And so Chebeague has, like many coastal towns and islands in Maine, has had a big focus on childcare, on housing, and also on climate resiliency. And she's really been able to kind of carry the torch and keep the focus on climate issues so they don't get sidetracked. And so she was recently elected as select board, and that I found to be very inspiring. It's not one particular thing that these people have said that has inspired me. And in thinking about why I was inspired by them, it reminded me of a quote that is actually on a bench here in Bath at a local preserve operated by the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust. And people attribute this quote to Maya Angelou. It's a little bit disputed as to its real origins, but the quote is, "People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And in the cases that I mentioned, I remember distinctly how these people have made me feel, which is inspired and motivated to do my work. So as it turns out in my investigations of the science of hope, hope is more than just a feeling. It's a healing agent, and it's actually a science. And this was brought to my attention earlier this winter, I guess, through a really good staff training that I attended at the Island Institute by Dr. Ashley Cross. And Ashley Cross, she referenced a lot of the work of who I think is called the Doctor of Hope, Dr. Chan Hellman, who's the founding director of the Hope Research Center at the University of Oklahoma, Tulsa. And he has found that hope has been shown to serve as a protective resilience factor when facing stressful life occurrences. And it's really about three primary components that you can see here: goals, agency thinking, and pathways thinking. So to break it down, it starts with goal setting. Do you have a meaningful goal? And then it goes to agency. Do you have the knowledge or determination that gives you confidence you can achieve your goal? And then lastly, pathways thinking. Do you have a plan and the willingness to tweak your plan? So importantly, hope is more than optimism. It's about taking action. And without the pathways thinking piece, it's simply wishful thinking. So in my role as a hope giver tonight, I did this. I built a goal, and my goal tonight is to motivate people to take climate action because things that they value are at risk, whether it's marine life or fisheries or communities. And number two, I believe that I'm capable of achieving it. This is the agency part, because of the training I've had, the research I do, and the practice that I've had in sharing this information. And so lastly, I have a plan, and it includes multiple methods of science translation to learn what resonates with people and to hone in on what's most effective. So the psychology literature I reviewed discussed how trauma, fear, and rumination can rob someone of hope. I haven't researched this myself, but I suspect that climate anxiety can do the same thing. Probably you guys have heard about climate anxiety, people feeling really anxious about the future of our planet. Maybe that's why you attended tonight. And so Dr. Hellman describes in a TED talk that he did last year that one of the single best predictors of hope is the connectedness that we have with each other. So meaning an important component to nurturing hope is through social outlets. So like showing up for this talk or getting involved with a local group like a land trust or a climate action commission, So now I'll transition to hope and climate science by bringing your attention to a paper here that is all about hope-based climate change communications, tailored specifically for the Gulf of Maine. So this came out of a conference that was held in Portland a few years ago that was put on by the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and other partners. The focus was on some of these climate stressors that I'll be talking about tonight. And this publication was a result of it. I'm going to just read one sentence from the abstract, 2 sentences, I guess. Scientists, policymakers, and practitioners often want to communicate to the public about the seriousness of the situation to encourage mitigation and adaptation. Many standard communication strategies that rely on fear and scientific authority alone, rather than comprehensive explanations that include solutions, can leave audiences feeling overwhelmed and disengaged instead of hopeful and motivated to act. So I'm going to give you a couple examples here of, well, the first example is a communication that I would consider to leave you feeling overwhelmed. And I'm using this not critically because I helped put this one together. It is a synopsis of a report that I helped compile last year on the updated climate stressors to Maine. Right at the top, it says, grappling with these extreme events can feel overwhelming. And so this is 10 notable indicators from the Maine Climate Science Update in 2021, for which I was a co-author. This particular update here was put together by the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. They're the state agency that runs the Climate Council, essentially, and I work really closely with them. But I'm going to read to you some of the highlights here, and you can decide whether it makes you feel motivated or overwhelmed. Okay, so these are basically facts about climate in Maine from last year. Driest period since 1895, second warmest year on record for Maine. The Gulf of Maine had its warmest fall on record. The third warmest winter temperature since 1895. Smoke from western state wildfires traversed the continent on the prevailing westerlies, reaching into Maine and degrading air quality. Sea levels were generally above average along the Maine coast through the end of the year. And if that wasn't enough, they added puff and chick survival this past year was 65% below the previous 17 years because of climate-related stressors. Okay, so that's one example of a climate communication that we as scientists use to share with the public about climate change in Maine. And I think the purpose of sharing this is not just to relay information, but to encourage people to do something. So this next example, which I don't know if I want to be I think I'm going to have people, unless you can operate this computer for me and find it, I think I would refer people to it. Okay, it's 4 minutes, and what it does is because Maine is such a natural resource dependent state, the information is coming from the people who are working in forests. In this case, this woman is a lobster woman from North Haven. And she's talking about the changes that she's seeing on the water and the things that she's doing to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And it really gives you some concrete examples of what Maine people are doing to improve their businesses and also mitigate climate change at the same time. So I think it's really, sorry that we didn't fix that
Maine
before.
workers in the waterfront, you mean?
What's that?
Yeah, Maine workers in the waterfront area.
Yeah, well, the video is more than just, this talks about ocean climate change, but the video features farmers, it features, I think it features foresters, so it's from all sectors. It talks about transportation and electric vehicles, and it really just is a quick glimpse of action that the state is taking in the last couple of years, particularly since we've had a climate plan. Okay, so that video, which if you can watch at home, is an example of this. Communication models that involve the head, or the understanding of climate change, the heart, hope through agency and efficacy, and the hands with the intention to participate in community action. And these further engagement in climate change conversations. So I'm going to try in the remainder of my talk to use that model. So using the head, so enhancing your understanding of climate change, and then also give you examples of how action is being taken already, and at the very end, things that you personally can do. So like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to touch on 3 climate stressors: ocean warming, ocean acidification, and sea level rise. And I'm going to pair them with action that's occurring here in Maine. So I'm going to start with ocean warming, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about, you probably have heard that the Gulf of Maine is warming really rapidly. We have a pretty good understanding of why we're warming so quickly. And so first off, a little bit of background. We know that Arctic warming and accelerating ice melt from Greenland is weakening this global circulation current. It's referred to as the AMOC. The acronym stands for Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. So the weakening of this kind of circulation, that's conveyor belt circulation that's happening, is linked with a northern shift of the Gulf Stream. So I forgot to orient you here. So this is Cape Cod, this is the Gulf of Maine here, Northeast Channel, Western Scotian Shelf, the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This is the Gulf Stream coming up from the south. This is the carrying warm, salty water. This is the Labrador Current carrying colder, fresher water. And importantly, this is the tail of the Grand Banks and the Northeast Channel and the Gulf of Maine. Those are the things to really key in on. So we know that the weakening of the AMOC is linked with the northward shift of this Gulf Stream and the retreat of the Labrador Current. And what's resulted is warmer water entering the Gulf of Maine through this Northeast Channel. And so that has been understood for about a decade. New insights have just been better understood in the last year. And so there's this regime shift that happened in the Gulf of Maine around 2008. And what these researchers have found, that beginning in 2008, the Gulf Stream actually migrated closer to the tail of the Grand Banks, and it reduced the input of the Labrador Current. And within 1 year of that warm, salty water over here, the subsurface warming progressed in the Gulf of Maine. And this has given us the ability to interpret that rapid temperature change that we've been seeing, and the ability to simulate the current interactions happening over here enhances the predictability of future warming events in the Gulf of Maine. So you might remember in 2012, we had what was called as a marine, kind of like our first marine heat wave, and it had very drastic implications for the lobster fishery. So what have ocean temperatures been, and where are they headed? Well, so this is a record of ocean temperature dating back to 1880. Okay, so this is annual average sea surface temperatures. And you can find all this on the climate science dashboard of the Maine Climate Council. And basically what you can see here is the historical average is 48.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's since 1880 to current day. Just of note, approximately the last 12 months, it's a little outdated, so like about the last 12 months, we've been about 3.8 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than this historical average. And what we're looking at here is projected temperatures under different emissions scenarios. And actually under the high emissions scenario, by 2050, we would have ocean temperatures in down East Maine similar to southern New England today. And ocean temperatures of the same as southern New England sound nice for swimming, but they drastically impact our marine species. And so we're seeing major changes in the distribution and abundance of our kind of traditional fisheries. For example, the important lobster fishery. So that's what we're looking at here on the left panel. Whoops. On the left panel, what you can see is these are scientific tows that are targeting lobster. And this is Cape Cod here. And we have the red spots and the dark orange spots are indicating where they caught a lot of lobsters, essentially. And that's back in 1972. And if you fast forward to more current day, you can see those tows are catching a lot more lobsters offshore and to the north. So very few lobsters being caught in the southern New England area. And this correlates precisely with warming water temperatures. So we expect to see that trend continue of the hotspots of biomass of lobsters moving north and offshore. Okay, so that's kind of bad news for the lobster fishery in the long term. So what's the seafood industry doing on their end to mitigate climate change? And this is one example that comes straight from the Island Institute website. This is in our solutions library, and it is about the Cranberry Isles Fishermen's Co-op. Cranberry Isles are located off Acadia National Park. There's other examples closer to here, Mooksea Farm on the Damascotta River, and Pendleton Yacht Yard and Penobscot Bay, I think. But basically, this example is similar to what I was telling you about Luke's Lobsters. It's a business's effort to decarbonize the working waterfront. And so what the Cranberry Isles Co-op has done was installed solar panels on the roof of their co-op. So they're a lobstermen's co-op. They've got about 20 something people who land lobsters, and they kind of share their electricity bills. And back in 2019, they decided they were going to install solar panels, and those solar panels were installed with their monthly loan repayment the same amount as their previous electricity bill. And that loan will be paid off in 7 to 9 years. And so in a few years, they're not going to have those monthly payments at all. So they received some federal funds to do this. They received a little bit of funding from the Island Institute to do this. They got federal tax rebates. And so it made a lot of economic sense. But the major driver for them doing this was to help reduce their carbon footprint, because they're critically aware of how climate is impacting their business. So other things are being done along the Maine coast to understand the greenhouse gas emissions of the Gulf of Maine seafood industry. This was a meeting that we held a few months ago in partnership with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and our Climate Common. One more example of what's being done is we have a very, what's the word? We have a very difficult to meet, but ambitious, thank you. We have a very ambitious goal at the Island Institute, is to help these early adopters who are interested in electric outboards, helping them to get electric outboards in their business, whether it be an aquaculturist on their skiff, whether it be a harbor master, or a lobster boat's dinghy. We're really trying to help these marine industry constituents on the path towards decarbonization. And in this case, what we mean by that is having them get electric outboards on their small boats. We're a ways away of having like electric lobster boats, but I mean, there are already electric boats here in Maine. And a couple of them are pictured here. This is an aquaculturist down in the southern Maine, and this Maine electric boat, they're located in Biddeford and are currently selling electric outboards. Hi there. That's okay. Okay, so this is bringing us to the second ocean climate stressor, ocean acidification, which, tell me, how much do you know about ocean acidification? You can raise your hand if you have heard of it. Do you want the 2-sentence background on how it's caused? Okay, so ocean acidification happens because of the carbon dioxide emissions that we are emitting into the atmosphere. A quarter to a third of those emissions are absorbed by the ocean. When CO2, carbon dioxide, and seawater mix, they form carbonic acid, and that decreases the pH of the ocean, which that means an increase in acidity. So this is going way back to like high school chemistry. The pH scale, it's a logarithmic scale. So little changes in units actually mean a big increase in acidity. So just this left panel here, how we know this is happening is that we have data on a station out on the volcano on the Big Island of Hawaii. Mauna Loa has a station that measures atmospheric carbon dioxide going back to 1958. There's also a pretty close station, relatively anyway, measuring carbon dioxide in seawater, also in the Hawaiian archipelago. And then, so you can see that's ocean carbon dioxide, and then you can see this is ocean pH here in blue. And as the atmospheric and oceanic carbon dioxide levels rise, the pH declines, and that's the increase in acidity that we're seeing. Why this matters here in Maine, we're actually uniquely susceptible from an environmental standpoint and an economic standpoint. Environmentally, we've got a lot of cold, fresh water coming in from our rivers. That water is more acidic. Cold water inherently absorbs CO2 more readily. And then the kind of semi-enclosed shape of the Gulf of Maine just holds on to that more acidic water for longer. And so that puts us in a difficult spot. And then on top of that, we have all these shell building species that are impacted first from ocean acidification. So if you look at our fisheries, we've got lobster making up 85% of the land use value. So lobster bringing the most money. But then you have soft-shell clams, the second most valuable fishery. And you have these burgeoning shellfish industries like oysters and mussels. All of those things secrete a shell, and that shell is vulnerable to increasing acidity. So it puts us in kind of a precarious position in terms of ocean acidification. Yeah.
Getting reports from the people on Zoom that they're having trouble hearing you when you're
Away
from the laptop, so just stand a little bit closer to it.
Got it, no
You can
problem.
push the podium out.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So,
Sorry about that. Okay, so the right panel here, oops. The right panel here is showing global surface ocean pH over time, dating back to 1900. And then these lines here are what we project pH to look like under different emission scenarios. So essentially, the more we emit, the lower the pH will go, the higher acidity we will see. So it's well within our grasp to mitigate this problem. So what are we doing locally to make an impact? Well, aside from just reducing emissions, how am I doing on time?
you are good. We've got half an hour.
Okay, so aside from reducing emissions, which are the root cause of acidification, there is research underway right now to look at the potential for marine vegetation to mitigate coastal ocean acidification and improve shellfish sustainability. So Nicole Price, who I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, she's at Bigelow Laboratory. I've been partnering with her for about 7 or 8 years now on research looking into exactly what's pictured in this conceptual diagram, which in short is that sugar kelp, as it grows, it photosynthesizes just like a land plant would, and it pulls out carbon dioxide from its ambient environment. So instead of a tree pulling carbon dioxide out from the air, this is sugar kelp pulling carbon dioxide out from the water around it. And so what we were interested in learning is at the scale of a kelp farm where there's tons of kelp growing in a very small space and photosynthesizing quite a bit. They grow from like microscopic in November to over 12 feet in April. So it grows. It's a very fast growing species of macroalgae. And what we wanted to know was, can we measure a difference in ocean acidity right around that kelp? And if so, will it have a positive benefit on those shell builders that are nearby? And so far, preliminary results are yes, in fact, we can measure that there is this halo of improved water quality around the kelp farm. And those mussels that have been grown for just a few months within that halo have thicker shells. So it's really promising, just real local research that's applicable to the marine industry right here in Maine. This research is happening in Casco Bay at a kelp farm off of Chebeague and now a kelp farm off of Clabberd Island. Oh, here it is. I forgot it. Included a picture of the site. This is the Bangs Island mussels location off of Clapboard Island. For those of you in the room, these are the mussel rafts here, and these buoys here are holding up the kelp. So there's multiple lines of kelp growing horizontally here. And right here is our instrument package measuring parameters that can tell us about ocean acidification. And then we have a control location where the same instrument package, not the same one, but the same instruments are away from the kelp and measuring the water quality parameters that we can basically, so we can understand what's going on with the water chemistry. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that in addition to kelp's farm seaweed's ability to remediate ocean acidification, there's lots of excitement around farming seaweeds for all sorts of climate services. And actually, this is a recent paper that's come out that has basically tied farm seaweeds to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so it talks about farm seaweeds being used for food, for biofuels, for bioplastics. And what is cool is that a lot of this research is happening right here in Maine. And with the growth of farm seaweed in Maine, I think there's great potential for not only the climate services of farm seaweeds, but perhaps more importantly, the food security that we can benefit from with more farm seaweeds. Okay, so this is the last climate stressor I'll talk about tonight. Probably one that you've heard quite a bit about. Maybe not in Brunswick, but here in Bath, there's a lot of concern about rising sea levels. So for those of you who aren't familiar with how we track rising seas, is scientists use tide gauges. And these tide gauges are installed and monitored by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. We have 5 tide gauges here in Maine, all the way down in Wells, Portland, Bar Harbor, Cutler, Eastport. And yeah, those are our 5 tide gauges. I've selected data from the Portland tide gauge because it's the closest to Bath where we are now. And just for a little bit of data, I'll walk you through the left panel. This is so that the Portland tide gauge has been in place since 1912. So we have a lot of data. This is the longest tide gauge, the tide gauge with the longest history in Maine. And you can go back and you can see this is monthly mean sea levels. And this line here is showing the historical average. And then the months, the years that had the highest month are here. And then the years that had the lowest month are here. And what you can notice about these years here, so a lot of the lows are from earlier in the 1900s. And a lot of the highs are from the last decade or decade and a half. So that's monthly means. This black line here is what's been happening in 2022. So no records, but certainly the last few months have been above average for monthly means. And if you go over here, this is perhaps even more easy to understand and informative. This is showing you the annual sea levels at this Portland station from 1912 to current day. And the blue line here shows you the rate of change over the whole time period, which is 0.62 feet per century. But if you look over the last 30 years, you can see that that rate has accelerated to almost a foot per century. And unfortunately, we know that that acceleration is going to continue into the future. And so again, this is, you can check this out on the Climate Council website, but this is again showing you monthly mean sea level trend, and then to current day, and then projected out into the future. This is the intermediate scenario, and this intermediate scenario has been adopted by the state of Maine as its kind of mandatory planning scenario. And so that's all state agencies now have to plan for 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 4 feet by 2100, and then prepare to manage. So they have to commit to this intermediate scenario, and they have to prepare for the high scenario, which is 3 feet by 2050 and 8.8 feet by 2100. Now, this would be for high risk infrastructure that really can't get wet. And so that's how you would make that distinction. Like, you know, something that you're building along the coast that is only designed to be around for 20 years, can accommodate water. You could plan for the intermediate scenario, but if it's something that's designed to be there for 50, 75 years, and it really can't get wet, like you have electricals on the main floor, then you really need to prepare to manage for the higher scenario. Now, oops, I just wanted to point out that with just 1 foot of sea level rise, we can expect to see 15 times more nuisance flooding than what we're seeing right now. And then at 4 feet, 75% of Maine's dry beaches are inundated. Now, those are depressing facts, but the reason why I mentioned it is because This next slide here is a picture taken right down the street in Bath. And so Bath residents are fairly familiar with nuisance flooding. This is the restaurant right over there. And we have kind of similar flooding in just down from my neighborhood in the northern section of town. And so these are sunny day, high tide flooding. And this type of flooding is going to become a lot more common as sea levels rise. We are fortunate here in Bath to have some pretty proactive city officials. And we have a good idea of what our vulnerabilities are just in terms of the main data that's provided by the Maine Geological Survey. You can go there and you can look up your house. You can look up your town. You can look up critical infrastructure that you're concerned about. I could show you where we are right now is here at Library Park. That restaurant that floods already on high tides is right here. And you can see Elm Street. Apologize, I can't really show the people online and show the people in the room at the same time. Elm Street here is very vulnerable. And then Water Street here is aptly named. It used to, a lot of fill is over here. So anyway, you can go to Maine Geological Survey's map viewer, and this is the highest astronomical tide plus 1.6 feet. And then you can check these boxes to look at what it would look like. So for instance, this is the 2100 high scenario here. You can check this and see just how much of the area you're concerned about is flooded. So like I said, Bath has been uniquely proactive for quite some time. Bath is one of 2 communities in Maine who have received the funding from the Design and Resilience team, which I love to include in my presentations because they are a group of architects and landscape architects and artists who are able to put together these fantastic sketches of how we might live with the water in the future. So they come to the community and they've done this in Bath and they've done this on Vinyl Haven. They come and do a community listening evening where they identify what the community's values are and really get a sense of what the community is interested in preserving and what are, cultural icons and the priorities and values of the community. And then they put together sketches that show how the community could consider adapting to the water that we can expect under future scenarios. So in this drawing here, we're here at the library. This is the Elm Street, Water Street area that I mentioned before. And so now we've got kind of water coming through and they call them green streets and green and blue fingers, the blue fingers obviously being where the water is coming. And they make suggestions about what types of green infrastructure you could put in to kind of slow and filter the stormwater and make, this is a very long report that's on the city's website. You can check it out. And there's a similar one for Vinyl Haven, which is also on their town website.
The blue is water.
Yeah, the blue is
And
water.
the green is what they project or what they.
Yeah, the green is what they call green infrastructure. So basically the installation of green spaces that can kind of absorb the extra water and provide some kind of buffer. So when I first started working on sea level rise, this situation was kind of a reality. And this is a comic that one of my friends and colleagues at the Island Institute drew and allows me to use my presentation. He's got all sorts of comics about things that aren't really that funny, but to make light of the situation that we're faced with. And so what this one says is, this is the government official. We can give you a community grant to study your community to find out what's vulnerable to flooding. And this person says, and to fix it once we know what our vulnerabilities are. And the government official says, well, you're on your own for that. And the townsperson said, well, but that's the expensive part. And that's true. So even just 5 years ago, we didn't have a lot of money available for infrastructure improvements. We had some money available through the state for doing vulnerability assessments and understanding what your vulnerabilities are, but it pretty much stopped there. And so the Island Institute has started to chip away at that over the last 5 or 6 years. We've been offering just small 10,000 max grants to towns to do various things related to sea level rise education, or up to, engineering studies. It can be used for anything really related to sea level rise education, all the way to infrastructure improvements. And I highlight two grants that we've funded that KELT, the Kennebec History Land Trust, has been a part of. One of them is restoring and enhancing a marsh, or a tidal marsh crossing over in Georgetown. And this other one is more of a collaboration with the Wells Estuarine Reserve and a number of other partners, where a bunch of towns, Bath, Phippsburg, Georgetown, can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but they have got together to basically connect their community officials to the emergency management folks, really to get people talking about resiliency and open those lines of communications that you might think are open, but really, I think it's highlighted that we could do a lot better job of preparing for disasters and flooding events. And so, like I said, a lot has changed on the funding side of things. There's a lot of money coming from the federal government. I'm not going to go through this. There's lots of money now available in the Maine state budget. People online can refer back to the recording if they want the details on the funding landscape. But one I wanted to bring to your attention that's part of the state budget is a new initiative called the Community Resilience Partnership. And Bath is now a member of the Community Resilience Partnership. They've had to do, these three things here in order to become a member. And then something that's very exciting is that Bath was just awarded a community action grant of $50,000. And so some of you may know that Bath has a climate action plan. We now have a climate action commission. Yeah, climate action commission that's operating. And like I said, we were just awarded $50,000 from the state to complete a current vulnerability assessment for public and private infrastructure, vulnerability to sea level rise and other flooding from storms, and to take that information and to update the city's climate action plan. So that's super exciting. We also just hired a sustainability coordinator, who I think is on Zoom. And yes, so lastly, I'm going to end here, but I'm going to end with a call to action for everybody who's here and listening. Is think back to that slide about the science of hope, and to set your own goal, and to improve your agency, and to make sure you have pathways thinking in order to fulfill your goal and meet your goal. And some places to start, if you need some ideas, would be right here, mainewon'twait.org. This is a great place to go for individuals, communities, businesses to understand how they can get started to take action on climate change. I also would recommend perusing the Island Institute Solution Library. There's lots of really practical stories where businesses and individuals have been interviewed about how they went about doing this. So how did the Cranberry Islands Fishermen's Co-op convince all of their lobster fishermen and women that putting up solar panels was a good idea? And then there's communications trainings that are now offered. Next one's coming up on September 3rd through Our Climate Common. And for those of you who are interested in fisheries and aquaculture, I'd really recommend watching Riley Stevenson's Reflections on the Future of the Fishing Industry. It's like a 35-minute documentary. She's a youth climate activist here in Maine, and she's interviewing four youth who are either engaged in lobster fishing or some type of aquaculture. And it's all about their reflections on their industry and how climate is impacting their industry. And then Maine Climate Action Now is always a good place to look for other ideas. So that's all I have for tonight. I'm happy to take any questions from folks on Zoom or folks in the room.